The dust motes danced in the fading light of a home that no longer belonged to them. For 51 years, Silas and Martha Montgomery had built a life of quiet dignity within these walls, weathering every storm with the calloused resilience of those who knew the true weight of honest labor. Now, that legacy was being dismantled and packed into cheap cardboard boxes by the very hands they had raised. Sterling, 48 years old and wearing a bespoke suit that cost more than a month of groceries, paced the worn hardwood floor of the living room. Beside him stood Clara, 45, her arms crossed tight as she surveyed her parents with a look of exhausted, bitter condescension. "You have to be realistic about this," Sterling said sharply. "You are 76 years old. Mom is 74. You are both losing your minds, and this cramped rental is just a stepping stone until we get you into the care facility where you belong. It is for your own good," Clara added coldly. They did not mention the lease buyout money. They did not mention the thousands of dollars they planned to pocket the moment their parents were declared legally incompetent and locked away in a sterile nursing home. It was a calculated, bloodless coup executed by children who viewed their creators not as family, but as a depreciating asset waiting to be liquidated. Silas did not argue. He simply kept his head bowed, his hands thick-scarred, and weathered by 40 years of grinding work as a structural engineer on high-steel construction sites, folding a simple flannel shirt. Martha sat beside him, her spine perfectly straight, her eyes reflecting a profound, unshakable stoicism. She did not cry, she did not beg. She merely placed her worn hand over his, a silent anchor in a storm of betrayal. They had been stripped of their autonomy. They had been reduced to burdens. The night was long and completely devoid of warmth. When the first gray light of dawn crept over the forgotten, ragged streets of Ridgeway, Tennessee, Silas woke in the suffocating silence of the temporary rental apartment. The temperature outside hovered near 38 degrees Fahrenheit, a bitter chill that seeped through the thin window panes and settled deep into his aging bones. He rose without making a sound. He pulled on his heavy canvas jacket, sliding his rough fingers into his pocket to feel the worn leather of his wallet. Inside, there was exactly $40. It was a pathetic, humiliating sum, the absolute dregs of a lifetime of grueling labor that had been systematically drained by the ungrateful, children sleeping comfortably in their affluent suburban homes. Silas walked out the door. He did not look back. The walk to the Ridgeway County Courthouse was a slow, deliberate 3-mile march over cracked asphalt and frost-covered dirt. Each step was a silent vow. He was a man who had spent 4 decades calculating the precise load-bearing limits of steel beams, pouring concrete foundation pillars deep into the earth, and raising structures that defied gravity. He knew exactly how things fell apart under pressure. More importantly, he knew how to build them back up from nothing. The courthouse steps were crowded with loud, arrogant men. Local contractors, real estate flippers, and wealthy landlords clustered together in tight circles, blowing thick clouds of cigar smoke into the freezing air while laughing loudly about their latest exploitations. They wore heavy wool coats and eager smiles, waiting like vultures to feast on the misery of foreclosed properties. Silas stood in the back. He was a ghost among wolves. The auctioneer stepped to the podium, his voice cutting through the bitter morning wind as he rattled off addresses and numbers. Sleek modern homes and sprawling acres of farmland were auctioned away for hundreds of thousands of dollars. The contractors barked their bids, waving their numbered paddles with arrogant, careless ease. Then, The auctioneer cleared his throat, pulling up a battered file that looked as though it had been dragged through the mud. "Next item is a county seizure," the auctioneer announced dryly. "Tax delinquency. The property is a heavily damaged residential structure on the south side of town. Rotted wood, cracked foundation, entirely uninhabitable. The city is practically begging someone to take this eyesore off our hands. Do we have a starting bid?" The crowd erupted into cruel, mocking laughter. "I would not take that garbage if you paid me," a wealthy contractor sneered loudly. "Burn it down," another man shouted with a cruel grin. Silas did not laugh. He stepped forward, his heavy boots scraping against the concrete, the sound drawing the irritated eyes of the wealthy men in their pristine leather shoes. The old structural engineer raised his calloused, scarred hand with slow, absolute precision. $3, Silas stated calmly. The courthouse square fell dead silent. The auctioneer stared at the old man, blinking in absolute disbelief, before looking around at the sea of wealthy contractors who were now shaking their heads in mocking pity. Nobody countered. Nobody cared. "Sold," the auctioneer declared flatly. "For $3. The transaction was a blur of dismissive paperwork and patronizing sighs from the county clerks inside the warm building. They handed him a fragile yellow deed, looking at him as if he were a confused, senile old fool who had just thrown away his last pennies on a pile of rotting debris. Silas took the paper with a steady hand, carefully folding it and placing it into his breast pocket next to his beating heart. He walked past the jeering crowd. They laughed. They whispered about the pathetic old man and his worthless pile of trash. But holding the deed to the most dilapidated, ruined house in the entire town of Ridgeway, Silas knew that the arrogant crowd was mocking him out of sheer, absolute ignorance. They looked at the address and saw only a rotting grave of splintered wood and collapsed dreams. But they did not know that the garbage he had just purchased for exactly $3 was not a heap of scrap, but the final, crucial piece needed to awaken a great, unstoppable secret. Silas led Martha down the broken sidewalk of the forgotten street, the bitter wind biting at their thin coats. The structure standing before them was barely a house. It was a rotting wooden corpse measuring exactly 400 square feet. The exterior was a tragedy of shattered glass, warped siding, rusted nails, collapsed gutters, and peeling paint that hung like dead skin from the rotting eaves. The roof sagged heavily under the weight of decades of neglect, missing shingles leaving dark, gaping holes like rotten teeth. The foundation was split by a jagged, terrifying crack that ran 2 feet up the concrete base. The yard was a dead wasteland of brown dirt, choked with invasive weeds and suffocating beneath the heavy, unmistakable stench of black mold and decay. It was a catastrophe. It was theirs. A sleek, black luxury sedan rolled slowly to a halt beside the crumbling curb, its polished chrome gleaming against the dreary landscape. Mayor Clayton lowered the tinted window, his perfectly manicured hands resting lightly on the heated leather steering wheel. He wore a patronizing smirk, staring down at the elderly couple standing in the freezing mud. His own sprawling estate, sitting on 20 acres of pristine landscaped hills, was a monument to his excessive wealth and arrogance. "This pile of trash is the disgrace of the neighborhood, Silas," the mayor sneered dismissively, his voice dripping with elitist disgust. "I am going to have the city condemn it and bulldoze it by the end of the month." Silas did not look at him. He kept his eyes on the rotting wood. The mayor scoffed loudly, rolling up his window and speeding away to his massive mansion. Inside, the gloom was absolute. The cold seeped through the splintered floorboards, chilling the stale air to a bitter 40 degrees Fahrenheit. Silas left his cheap mobile phone resting against the wooden crate they were using as a table. It vibrated violently against the rough surface. He pressed the button to answer, putting the device on the speaker. "You are absolutely insane," Sterling yelled through the tinny speaker, his voice filled with venomous, greedy rage. "Buying a ruined shack. You are humiliating us. You are actively trying to destroy the lease buyout money that rightfully belongs to this family. We are calling our lawyers tomorrow morning to fast-track the conservatorship and lock you both away. You are sick old fools," Clara spat bitterly over the line. "We are taking control." Silas listened to the poison. He calmly reached out. He ended the call. Night fell over the ruined 400 square feet. They had nothing but 2 thin air mattresses placed directly over the freezing, uneven floorboards. A single, bare incandescent bulb dangled from a frayed wire on the ceiling, casting long, wavering shadows across the ruined walls. The silence was heavy, broken only by the steady, rhythmic dripping of icy rainwater leaking through the roof and hitting a tin bucket in the corner. They did not complain. They did not shed a single tear. Martha sat quietly on her deflated mattress. Her hands, wrinkled and stained with the day's dirt, reached for a battered cardboard box she had carried out of the rental apartment. She opened the flaps with immense, deliberate care. From beneath a pile of old tax receipts, she withdrew a heavy, rolled parchment. She spread it open under the weak yellow light. It was a university diploma. Dated 1974, the elegant calligraphy declared her a master of landscape architecture. It was a brilliant, hard-earned testament to her immense intellect, an untarnished dream she had buried in the dark for exactly 51 years. She had sacrificed her own towering ambitions, choosing instead to stay home, cook endless meals, and raise the very children who now sought to destroy her. She ran her scarred fingers over the faded gold seal, her stoic face reflecting a quiet, unbreakable resolve. The time for hiding was over. The soil beneath this ruin was waiting. Silas watched his wife from across the small freezing room. The sheer dignity radiating from her silent posture fueled the fire in his aging muscles. He stood up slowly, his joints popping in the cold, and walked toward the cramped, decaying kitchen to empty the overflowing tin bucket. As he reached for the metal handle, the weak light from the single bulb shifted slightly, illuminating a dark corner. He stopped dead. His breath caught in his throat. There, carved deep into the rotting wood of the kitchen door frame, partially hidden beneath layers of ugly gray paint, were small, frantic scratches. They were not random marks made by animals. They were deliberate, measured notches, rising vertically up the wood, marking inches and feet from a time long forgotten. Someone had stood young children against this very frame, carefully tracking their growth year after year with the sharp blade of a pocket knife. Silas traced the highest notch with his calloused thumb, feeling the sharp indentation against his rough skin. Amidst the agonizing, rhythmic dripping of the cold rainwater in the dead of night, the old man felt his 76-year-old heart suddenly skip a heavy beat. Dawn broke over Ridgeway with a pale, freezing light that offered no warmth. The temperature outside remained a brutal 35 degrees Fahrenheit, frosting the dead weeds in the yard. Silas was already awake. He did not waste time staring at the ruins or complaining about the stiffness in his 76-year-old joints. He simply reached for the heavy steel crowbar he had carried in his battered canvas bag. It was time to work. He was a man who had spent 40 years reading the invisible language of stress, tension, load paths, and structural integrity. He approached the sagging walls not with the fear of an old man, but with the cold, calculated precision of a master engineer. He drove the flat end of the crowbar into the rotting drywall, ripping away the damp, moldy surface with a violent tear. The dead material fell away in heavy chunks, raising a thick cloud of suffocating dust in the small room. He stared into the hollow cavity. He reached his rough hand inside. Beneath the hideous rotting exterior, the true skeleton of the 400-square-foot house was finally exposed. Silas ran his calloused fingers over the vertical studs, feeling the dense, unyielding grain of the wood. It was solid white oak. Modern contractors build houses with cheap, fast-growing pine that warped, splintered, and snapped under the immense pressure of gravity and time. But this frame had been cut from slow-growing, impenetrable old-growth trees. It was heavy, perfectly straight, and completely untouched by the moisture that had ruined the outer skin. The structural bones of the house were perfectly intact. Silas moved to the floorboards. He tore up the warped, water-damaged planks, exposing the heavy floor joists beneath. He placed his steel level across the massive wooden beams. The suspended bubble rested perfectly, dead center. It had not shifted a single inch. He walked outside into the bitter wind, kneeling in the frozen dirt to examine the terrifying 2-foot jagged crack in the concrete foundation. Mayor Clayton and the arrogant city inspectors had cited this exact flaw as the fatal blow to the property. Silas pulled a heavy wire brush from his pocket, aggressively scrubbing away decades of accumulated dirt, moss, and loose debris. He took out a thick steel chisel and tapped the edges of the long fissure. The sound was sharp and resonant. It was not dull and hollow. The terrifying crack was entirely superficial. It was a mere cosmetic flaw in the outer stucco coating, an ugly, jagged scar masking an impenetrable core of high-strength concrete that reached deep into the unyielding earth. The foundation was as solid as bedrock. The arrogant men at the courthouse had been absolute fools. They had judged a book by its ruined cover, completely blind to the magnificent engineering hidden beneath the decay. Silas walked back inside. Martha was quietly sweeping the loose debris from the kitchen area, her face a mask of serene concentration. He walked past her, his sharp eyes drawn back to the mysterious notches carved into the wooden door frame. The weak morning light hit the wood at a different angle now, revealing deeper grooves hiding beneath the thick peeling layers of ugly gray paint. He took a sharp scraping blade from his pocket. He began to peel the paint away. Stroke by stroke, the heavy gray flakes fell to the floor like dead leaves. He worked with agonizing care, scraping down to the raw, original wood. The notches he had felt in the dark became exceptionally clear. They were height markers, but right above the highest mark, carved with a steady, determined hand, were two distinct letters. S.M. Silas froze entirely. His breathing stopped. He scraped exactly 1 inch to the right, his scarred hand suddenly trembling against the wood. 2 more letters emerged from the darkness. Silas Montgomery. Martha Montgomery. He dropped the steel blade. It clattered loudly against the floorboards. Martha stopped sweeping, turning to look at her husband. She saw his wide eyes, the profound shock radiating from his rigid posture, and walked slowly to his side. She looked at the carved letters, her own wrinkled hand reaching out to touch the initials that she had carved herself. It was not a random, ruined house. It was their house. This was the very first home they had ever purchased, a tiny starter cabin bought on Valentine's Day in the year 1975. They had paid exactly $11,800 for it, scraping together every single penny from Silas's first brutal construction jobs and Martha's early landscaping work. It was the place where they had first dreamed, where they had marked the heights of the very children who were now trying to destroy them. Over the decades, the street names had changed, the town boundaries had shifted, and the house had been buried under hideous renovations by subsequent owners until it was completely unrecognizable. But the core remained untouched. Silas reached into his breast pocket. He pulled out the yellowed courthouse deed. He stared at the purchase price of exactly $3, holding it up against the memory of the $11,800 they had spent 51 years ago. The universe had not thrown them into the gutter. It had brought them home. Martha looked up at him, her eyes burning with an intense, quiet fire. "We are going to fix it," she whispered firmly. Silas nodded slowly. The solid white oak bones of their past had been found, waiting patiently beneath the rot to be resurrected. But to revive this magnificent masterpiece with absolutely empty pockets and fading strength, Silas and Martha were about to step into a realm of punishing, relentless physical labor that would make even the most muscular youthful men tremble with fear. The digital world of the wealthy suburbs was entirely consumed by loud, frantic noise. Sterling and Clara sat in their climate-controlled living rooms miles away from the rotting 400-square-foot house, furiously typing on their glowing smartphones to complain to their elite social circles. They posted lengthy, dramatic updates about the unbearable emotional burden of dealing with their supposedly demented parents, painting themselves as the tragic victims of an old couple who had completely lost their grip on reality. They wanted sympathy. They wanted validation. Silas and Martha Montgomery wanted absolutely nothing from anyone. While their children manufactured digital drama from the comfort of plush leather sofas, the 76-year-old man and his 74-year-old wife were awake before the sun broke over the freezing horizon, stepping out into a brutal 40-degree Fahrenheit morning to begin a daily routine of punishing, silent labor. They worked 12 to 14 hours a day. They did not stop for breaks. They did not sit down to rest their aching spines. They simply moved with the steady, mechanical rhythm of a bygone era. Silas stood in the freezing dirt of the front yard, his thick boots planted firmly beside a heavy plastic mixing trough. He hoisted an 80-pound bag of dry concrete over his shoulder, a task that would have ruptured the discs of men 30 years his junior, and dropped it into the basin. He sliced the heavy paper open with his utility knife, pouring exactly 3 gallons of ice-cold water into the gray dust. He gripped a heavy steel hoe. He began to mix. His scarred arms bulged beneath his flannel shirt, driving the steel blade through the thick, resistant sludge with brutal, rhythmic force until the concrete reached the exact consistency of wet sand. He carried heavy steel buckets of the mixture to the cracked foundation, applying the fresh cement with a steel trowel to seamlessly weld the old structure to the new support pillars he had driven 4 feet deep into the unforgiving earth. Above him, the roof was a battlefield of splintered wood and rusted metal. Silas climbed a heavy aluminum extension ladder, balancing 15 feet in the air while a bitter wind whipped across the exposed rafters. He tore away the rotted shingles with a massive steel pry bar, his knuckles bleeding in the cold as he hammered down fresh, heavy-duty tar paper and drove hundreds of 2-inch galvanized roofing nails into the solid white oak frame. He did not groan. He did not hesitate. Down in the mud, Martha was fighting her own silent war against the neglected earth. The yard sloped downward toward the street, a terrible, eroded grade that had funneled decades of rainwater directly into the foundation. She knelt in the freezing brown sludge, her bare hands digging into the earth to carve out the precise, sweeping curves of a retaining wall. She walked to the edge of the property, wrapping her arms around heavy, jagged river stones that weighed 30 pounds each. She carried them to the trench. She placed them down. She repeated this agonizing process hundreds of times, her 74-year-old back bending and lifting as she meticulously stacked the heavy stones to create a perfectly level, tiered terrace spanning 40 feet across the property line. She possessed a master's degree in landscape architecture, a brilliant, highly educated mind that understood the exact mathematical load of soil retention, but she executed her vision with the bruised, muddy hands of a common laborer. Word of the elderly couple's insane undertaking spread through the small, forgotten town of Ridgeway. Down on Main Street, Hank, the owner of the local hardware store, watched silently as Silas walked into his shop for the 4th time that week. Silas carried a heavy spool of copper electrical wire and 2 50-pound boxes of steel screws to the checkout counter. His canvas jacket was coated in a thick layer of white dust, and his weathered face was completely devoid of exhaustion. Hank looked at the cash register screen. The total was nearly $200. Hank looked down at Silas's hands, seeing the deep, fresh cuts on his knuckles, the dirt embedded beneath his fingernails, and the unmistakable, hardened calluses of a man who was fighting to reclaim his dignity. Hank reached out and cleared the screen. "I am running a massive overstock sale on all structural hardware and copper wiring this week." Hank lied softly, his eyes filled with profound respect. "Your total is $24. Silas looked up. He knew exactly what lumber and copper cost. He looked into Hank's eyes, seeing the quiet solidarity of a fellow working man. Silas nodded slowly. "Thank you," Silas murmured deeply. While the working class of the town quietly rallied behind the sweat of the old engineer, Mayor Clayton sat in his massive 20-acre estate, boiling with arrogant rage. The mayor had publicly promised his wealthy real estate investors that the rotting shack would be condemned and bulldozed to make way for a lucrative commercial zoning project. Now, this stubborn old fool was publicly humiliating him by resurrecting the property right before the eyes of the entire town. The mayor picked up his telephone. He made a vicious call. The very next afternoon, a sleek white county vehicle aggressively parked on the cracked pavement in front of the 400-square-foot house. A heavily built city building inspector stepped out, wearing a crisp uniform and carrying a thick aluminum clipboard. He marched up the muddy driveway with an arrogant sneer, fully prepared to shut down the unauthorized, illegal construction site of a senile old man. "Cease all labor immediately," the inspector shouted aggressively, stepping over Martha's carefully laid stones. "You are violating a dozen county codes. I am issuing a stop work order and citing you for unpermitted structural modifications. Put the tools down." Silas was standing on a wooden scaffold, holding a heavy pneumatic nail gun. He lowered the tool. He climbed down. Silas did not argue. He did not yell. And he did not plead with the angry official. He simply walked to a heavy steel toolbox sitting on the porch, unlatched the heavy metal clasps, and withdrew a thick, waterproof plastic folder. He walked back to the aggressive inspector and silently handed him the documents. The inspector snatched the folder with a condescending huff. He opened it, expecting to see crude, hand-drawn scribbles of a confused old man. Instead, he froze. The blood drained completely from the inspector's face. Inside the folder were absolutely flawless, highly technical architectural blueprints drawn on premium vellum paper. Every single load-bearing wall, every electrical circuit, every plumbing route, and every foundation anchor was meticulously mapped out with precise geometric calculations. Stamped directly onto the front page in heavy red ink was the official seal of the State Engineering Board, accompanied by 3 approved, fully paid county permits that Silas had secured months in advance before the hostile children had even hatched their plot. The structural modifications adhere strictly to Section 4-A of the Residential Building Code, Silas stated calmly, his voice ringing with the quiet, terrifying authority of a master who had built towering skyscrapers. The foundation pillars are sunk 48 inches deep, resting completely beneath the local frost line. The electrical wiring is 12-gauge copper, exceeding the minimum safety requirements by 20%. You will find all inspection schedules attached to the second page. The inspector swallowed hard. He looked at the old man's muddy boots. I see, the inspector stammered weakly, nervously closing the plastic folder and handing it back. Everything appears to be in order. Have a good day, sir. The inspector hurried back to his vehicle and sped away, completely defeated by the sheer, unassailable weight of bureaucratic perfection and undeniable expertise. Silas turned back to the scaffold, picking up his nail gun as if nothing had happened. The Stoic labor continued, bleeding into the freezing evenings. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long, dark shadows across the terraced yard, an old, rusty sedan pulled up to the curb. Beatrice, the quiet, frail elderly neighbor who lived 2 doors down, stepped out into the cold. She wore a heavy wool shawl wrapped tightly around her thin shoulders. She did not say a single word as she walked onto the muddy property. She carried a large thermos of hot black tea and 2 ceramic mugs. She set them gently on the wooden porch. Then, Beatrice walked over to the dirt trench where Martha was exhausted, struggling to lift a heavy river stone. Beatrice knelt in the freezing mud. She placed her frail hands on the heavy stone. Together, the 2 old women lifted the rock and pushed it firmly into the earth. Martha looked at her neighbor, offering a slight, incredibly weary nod of gratitude. Beatrice simply smiled softly, adjusting her wool shawl, and reached for the next rock. No grand speeches were made. No tears were shed. It was just the silent, powerful communion of those who understood the sacred, healing power of building something from nothing. Day by day, the ruined shell vanished. The warped, rotting siding was entirely replaced by beautiful, straight planks of deep cedar. The sagging, dangerous roof was now a crisp, perfect line of heavy dark shingles that shed the freezing rain with ease. The terrifying foundation crack was buried beneath a solid, impenetrable wall of reinforced concrete. The dead, toxic yard of mud and mold had been sculpted into a breathtaking, structured landscape of terraced stone and rich, waiting soil. The 400-square-foot house was no longer a rotting corpse. It was a fortress. But as the beautiful cedar wood gleamed in the afternoon sun and the town began to whisper in absolute awe about the miraculous resurrection, the sharp, bitter scent of pure envy drifted through the county lines, drawing the wealthy, arrogant children out of their comfortable suburban mansions. And they were bringing a vicious legal weapon designed to rip the finished masterpiece right out from under their parents' calloused, bleeding hands. The true treasure of the property was not buried gold or hidden cash. It was the earth itself. For over 5 decades, a massive sugar maple tree had stood at the edge of the property line, shedding its heavy canopy of broad leaves onto the neglected yard autumn after autumn. While the previous owners had ignored the yard, allowing it to become a chaotic jungle of invasive weeds, they had inadvertently protected the soil from the toxic chemical fertilizers and harsh pesticides that sterilized the pristine lawns of the wealthy suburbs. Martha sank her trowel deep into the dark, freezing ground, cutting through the ugly surface layer of dead crabgrass. She pulled the earth back. The smell was incredibly rich and intoxicating. Beneath the shallow crust of neglect lay 2 solid feet of pure, unadulterated leaf mold. It was a horticultural goldmine, a perfectly composed organic layer created by 51 years of uninterrupted natural decomposition. It was black, crumbly, and teeming with unseen microscopic life. Martha scooped a handful of the freezing soil, holding it up to the weak winter sun with a look of profound, quiet reverence on her weathered face. Her brilliant mind ignited. The entire neighborhood of Ridgeway had suffered from chronic, devastating flooding for years, with heavy rainwater cascading down the asphalt streets and pooling in the yards of the forgotten homes. Armed with the brilliant, suppressed intellect of a master landscape architect, Martha began to sculpt the earth with mathematical perfection. She spent agonizing days on her aching knees, using wooden stakes and tightly pulled mason twine to calculate the exact topography of the 400-square-foot lot. She moved tons of soil by hand, working with nothing but a rusted steel shovel and a battered wheelbarrow. She graded the dark earth into a magnificent, sweeping basin. She engineered a precise 2% slope, carving subtle, curving channels that would capture the violent runoff from the street and guide it gently into the deep, absorbent organic matter. She planted dormant roots of native switchgrass, deep-rooted coneflowers, and hardy swamp milkweed around the edges of the depression, carefully arranging the heavy river stones to slow the velocity of the incoming water. It was a highly sophisticated rain garden. When the first massive, freezing rainstorm of the season slammed into the county, the wealthy, perfectly manicured lawns of Mayor Clayton's neighborhood were entirely washed out by mud and overflowing gutters. But on the forgotten street of Ridgeway, a miracle occurred. The torrential water poured down the cracked asphalt and was instantly captured by Martha's meticulous design. The rain pooled beautifully within the stone terraces, sinking rapidly into the porous leaf mold and completely sparing the surrounding houses from the devastating floodwaters. The entire street remained perfectly dry. The sheer genius of the ecological design could not be hidden from the world. A prominent national architecture and landscape magazine, tipped off by an awestruck local environmental inspector, dispatched a professional photography team to the tiny, resurrected property. They arrived in sleek, expensive vans, stepping out into the cold air with heavy cameras and massive lighting rigs. The journalists were completely stunned by the breathtaking contrast between the dying, impoverished town and the absolute perfection of the tiny cedar house surrounded by a masterful ecological oasis. The lead journalist approached the porch. He held a digital audio recorder toward the old man. "Mr. Montgomery," the journalist asked respectfully, his eyes scanning the incredibly detailed cedar woodwork and the flawless stone terraces. "People in the elite development circles are completely baffled by this project. You poured months of brutal, back-breaking labor into a condemned 400-square-foot ruin in a dying town. You could have easily walked away and retired comfortably. Why did you choose to resurrect this exact piece of trash?" Silas did not smile. He wiped the sawdust from his calloused, bleeding hands with a rough canvas rag. He walked slowly into the warm, incredibly solid house, his heavy work boots thudding against the reinforced white oak floorboards. He returned a moment later, holding a small, handmade wooden frame. He handed it to the journalist. Inside the frame, pressed neatly beneath a pane of clear glass, were two pieces of paper. On the left was the faded, yellow deed from the courthouse auction, clearly displaying the humiliating purchase price of exactly $3. On the right was an ancient, crumbling bank receipt dated Valentine's Day of 1975, showing a mortgage payment of $11,800 for the exact same address, signed by a very young Silas and Martha Montgomery. "We did not buy a piece of trash," Silas stated calmly, his deep voice carrying the unyielding weight of half a century of devotion. "We bought our home back." The journalist stared at the frame in absolute shock. The resulting article exploded across the country like a massive, unstoppable shockwave. It was a stunning, emotionally devastating piece of journalism that exposed the tragic reality of stolen legacies, the cruel arrogance of the modern real estate machine, and the towering dignity of an elderly couple who had reclaimed their history with their own bleeding hands. The story resonated deeply with millions of people, a testament to the bitter struggle of trying to build a life in a world that constantly tried to tear them down. They became legends overnight. But the roaring applause of the national media meant absolutely nothing to the cold, calculating bureaucracy of the local government. The intense publicity had drawn the hungry, greedy eyes of the County Tax Assessment Board. If the house was no longer a worthless ruin, it was suddenly a prime target for heavy taxation. The heavy white envelope arrived on a quiet Tuesday morning. Silas stood in the warm kitchen, sipping a cup of steaming black coffee as he tore open the official county seal. He unfolded the thick, watermarked paper, expecting to see a moderate, standard reassessment for the new cedar siding and the basic structural repairs. His eyes scanned the bureaucratic text, moving slowly down to the final bolded number at the bottom of the page. The room was completely silent. The heavy ceramic coffee cup slipped from his rough, calloused fingers and shattered violently against the solid oak floor. The dark coffee seeped slowly into the flawless joints of the white oak floorboards. Silas Montgomery stared at the heavy official paper. He did not blink. He did not breathe. Martha walked quietly into the warm kitchen. She carried a simple cotton towel, kneeling down to wipe the spilled liquid without asking a single question. Her calm eyes shifted from the broken ceramic shards to the trembling, calloused hands of her husband. She stood up. She took the paper. A week prior, the senior appraiser of Ridgeway County had walked through their tiny front door with a clipboard and a cynical sneer, expecting to penalize a couple of old fools for executing a cheap, dangerous, unpermitted renovation. Instead, the seasoned professional had been struck entirely speechless. He had dragged his flashlight across the flawless structural joints, The perfectly insulated walls, the brilliant, code-exceeding 12-gauge copper wiring, and the incredibly complex ecological terrace outside. He noted the heavy cedar, the impenetrable concrete foundation, and the master-level craftsmanship that completely overshadowed 90% of the highly paid commercial contractors operating in the entire state of Tennessee. The appraiser had done the math. The math was absolute. Martha traced her scarred finger across the bold, black ink at the bottom of the page. The county had officially reclassified the condemned 400-square-foot ruin. The property they had purchased on the courthouse steps for exactly $3 was no longer considered a low-income shelter. It was now registered as a master-crafted, high-efficiency, eco-integrated luxury estate. The official market valuation was $520,000. Martha did not gasp. Silas simply closed his eyes. It was a staggering, monumental figure that completely shattered the local real estate records. But the sheer poetry of the number lay in its direct, humiliating comparison to the arrogant ruling class of the dying town. Mayor Clayton, the cruel man who had openly mocked them in the freezing mud, lived in a sprawling, gaudy mansion on 20 acres of land. His massive, poorly constructed estate was valued at exactly $410,000. Their tiny, 400-square-foot cabin was worth exactly $110,000 more than the mayor's sprawling palace. The irony was devastating. The highest valued property in the entire town of Ridgeway was a tiny wooden box built by a 76-year-old man and his 74-year-old wife using bare hands, salvaged stones, and sheer, unbreakable willpower. "It is just a number," Silas murmured softly, his deep voice devoid of arrogance or greed. "It is proof," Martha replied calmly, folding the thick document and placing it neatly into her wooden box of memories. They did not celebrate. They did not open champagne or scream in triumph. Silas simply grabbed a broom to sweep up the broken ceramic, and Martha walked outside to check the moisture levels of her dormant switchgrass. Their victory was incredibly silent, a profound, internal vindication that needed absolutely no audience to be real. But a document of that magnitude could not remain a secret in a bureaucratic office. The staggering valuation leaked from the county clerk's desk by noon. It ripped through the digital networks of the wealthy suburbs like a violent, uncontrollable wildfire. The miserable, decaying town of Ridgeway suddenly held a $500,000 crown jewel, and the scent of that immense, unexpected wealth immediately triggered the absolute worst predatory instincts of the people who had abandoned them. The quiet peace of the afternoon was suddenly shattered. The aggressive screech of heavy tires tore across the asphalt. A sleek, imported luxury sedan violently slammed on its brakes directly in front of the cedar house, tearing deep, ugly gouges into the loose gravel of the driveway. The heavy car door swung open. Sterling stepped out onto the pristine stone terrace, his face completely flushed with feverish, desperate greed, holding a thick, ominous legal file tightly in his shaking hand. The heavy car door slammed shut, the sound echoing like a violent gunshot across the quiet, dignified landscape of the resurrected property. Sterling, 48 years old and sweating profusely through his expensive designer clothing, marched aggressively up the perfectly graded stone pathway. Right behind him was Clara, 45 years old, her sharp features twisted into a grotesque mask of manufactured concern and unbridled, desperate greed. They did not look at the flawless cedar siding. They did not notice the masterfully engineered rain garden that had completely saved the block from catastrophic flooding. They only saw a sudden, massive pile of money that they believed was rightfully theirs. Silas sat completely still on the wooden porch. He was wiping his heavy work boots with a cloth. "Dad," Sterling began loudly, projecting his voice so the distant neighbors could hear his fake, theatrical distress. "We have been worried sick about you two. You vanished into this dangerous, condemned neighborhood without a single word. We had to hire people just to find you. You are 76 years old, and Mom is 74. You are clearly not in your right minds, living in this tiny, freezing wooden box. We are taking you home," Clara added smoothly, her eyes darting greedily toward the solid wooden front door. "Sterling has the conservatorship papers right here in this folder. A judge will grant us full legal guardianship by tomorrow morning. We are going to sell this place, put the money into a trust that we will manage for your protection, and get you the professional medical help you desperately need. It was a venomous, flawlessly executed trap. It was built entirely on lies." Silas did not raise his voice. He did not jump up from his chair, and he did not hurl bitter insults at the two blood-sucking parasites who had once been his children. He simply tossed the dirty cloth onto the porch, stood up slowly, and opened the heavy white oak front door. Martha was waiting inside. The 74-year-old woman stood behind the heavy, handcrafted dining table that Silas had built entirely from scratch. She did not look like a frail, demented victim of old age. She stood incredibly tall, her spine perfectly straight, her eyes radiating the terrifying, absolute authority of a master architect who had just built an impenetrable fortress out of garbage. Silas gestured for his children to enter. Sterling and Clara stepped over the threshold, their arrogant smirks faltering slightly as they took in the breathtaking, flawless interior of the 400-square-foot cabin. "You want to talk about our mental competence," Silas stated calmly, his deep voice devoid of any warmth or mercy. Martha reached out. She began to place the absolute truth onto the table. First, she unrolled her magnificent university degree from 1974, the heavy parchment proving her master-level education in landscape architecture. Next to it, she laid out the incredibly complex, mathematically perfect structural blueprints that Silas had drafted by hand, documents filled with advanced calculus, load-bearing physics, and hydrological engineering that had flawlessly directed the renovation of the ruined shell. She pointed to the exact calculations for the foundation pillars, the sheer strength of the 12-gauge copper wire, and the precise 2% slope of the exterior terraces. Sterling stared at the complex math. He could not comprehend a single equation. "You claim we are senile," Martha said quietly, her voice cold and steady. "You claim we are entirely incapable of managing our own lives. Yet my husband and I personally designed, permitted, and executed a massive structural overhaul that exceeded every single stringent building code in the state of Tennessee. Here are the signed medical and psychiatric evaluations we quietly obtained from the county hospital last month, declaring us both in the top 1% of cognitive function for our age bracket." She placed the crisp medical certificates right in front of Clara. Clara physically recoiled. Finally, Silas reached into his heavy canvas jacket. He pulled out the thick, watermarked document from the County Tax Assessment Board. He dropped it flat onto the center of the oak table. The bold, black numbers at the bottom of the page stared up at the two greedy children like a loaded weapon, completely shattering their pathetic illusion of control. $520,000. Silas read the number aloud. his voice dropping an octave, striking the room with the heavy, unyielding force of a steel beam. "This property, which we purchased for exactly $3, is now officially the most valuable real estate in this entire town. It is worth exactly $110,000 more than the massive mansion of the mayor you so desperately admire. We built this immense wealth with our bare, bleeding hands while you sat in your comfortable homes plotting to steal our last pennies." Sterling opened his mouth to speak. No words came out. "The conservatorship is a fraudulent threat," Silas continued, stepping closer to his son, his towering, calloused presence overwhelming the younger man. "If you file those papers, we will immediately countersue for malicious prosecution. We will hand these medical certificates, these blueprints, and this historic valuation directly to a federal judge. You will be publicly exposed, utterly humiliated, and financially ruined by the ensuing legal fees. Do you understand?" The silence in the room was absolute. It was crushing. The sheer weight of the comma, delivered not through hysterical screaming or violent physical altercations, but through the calm, undeniable presentation of supreme competence and massive financial success, completely broke them. Sterling's face turned a sickening shade of pale gray. His soft, manicured hands trembled violently. He dropped the thick legal file onto the floorboards. Clara could not even look her mother in the eyes. "Get out," Silas commanded softly. They turned and fled. They scrambled out the door, tripping over the heavy stone terraces in their desperate haste to escape the suffocating aura of their parents' overwhelming power. They threw themselves into their luxury sedan, peeling away from the curb and fleeing back to their hollow, artificial lives, knowing with absolute certainty that they had been utterly defeated by the very people they had tried to destroy. Silas and Martha stood on the porch, watching the car disappear into the distance. But the universe was not entirely finished delivering its brutal justice. As the dust settled on the cracked asphalt, a heavy, exhausted figure appeared at the end of the street. It was Mayor Clayton. The arrogant, powerful man who had laughed at Silas on the courthouse steps and threatened to bulldoze their dreams was not driving his sleek black luxury car. He was walking on foot, his expensive leather shoes completely ruined by thick, foul-smelling mud that clung to his expensive trousers. He trudged up the beautifully engineered pathway. He stopped at the bottom of the wooden steps. The heavy rainstorm that had perfectly watered Martha's dormant switchgrass had completely devastated the mayor's massive 20-acre estate. His cheap, poorly engineered retaining walls had violently collapsed, sending thousands of gallons of muddy water pouring directly into his luxurious basement, destroying everything he owned. The mayor looked up at the old, calloused engineer. All of his political arrogance, all of his elite pride, had been completely stripped away by the sheer force of nature. "Mr. Montgomery," the mayor rasped weakly, looking down at his muddy hands in utter defeat, "my entire property is sinking. The city engineers cannot stop the water. I need your help." The enemies bowed their heads and retreated into their absolute shame, surrendering the quiet peace back to the incredibly resilient garden, a sacred space where Silas and Martha were finally preparing to embrace the most brilliant, breathtaking dawn in the final, magnificent chapter of their long lives. The resurrection of the 400-square-foot house did not just save 2 elderly lives. It sent a massive, undeniable shockwave of pure, quiet inspiration straight down the cracked asphalt of the forgotten street. The dead, rotting neighborhood, once entirely abandoned by the arrogant world, slowly woke up. It started with small, silent acts of defiance against the crushing decay. Beatrice began pulling the suffocating, invasive weeds from her tiny front yard with her frail, bare hands. Hank, the hardware store owner, drove his rusted truck down the block on a freezing Saturday morning, dropping off discounted lumber, heavy steel nails, and gallons of fresh paint at the doorsteps of the most impoverished homes. Sagging roofs were meticulously patched with fresh, heavy tar paper. Rotting wooden fences were torn down and completely rebuilt. The dead street finally breathed again. Every single Saturday, without fail, Silas and Martha Montgomery opened their beautiful cedar gates to the entire community. They did not charge a single penny for their time. Silas stood proudly on the heavy oak porch, teaching young, calloused men how to calculate the sheer structural load of a support beam, how to read complex architectural blueprints, and how to properly sink concrete anchors exactly 48 inches deep beneath the frost line. Martha knelt in the dark, rich earth, showing tired, overwhelmed mothers how to naturally balance the acidity of the leaf mold and plant deep-rooted native flora to entirely stop the destructive county floods. The bitter winds of late December swept across the valley, dropping the temperature down to a freezing 30 degrees Fahrenheit. But the tiny cedar house radiated immense, undeniable warmth. The long, brutal war against age, betrayal, and time was finally over. They had won completely. As the golden hour of the dying winter sun cast long, beautiful shadows across the terraced yard, Silas and Martha sat peacefully side by side. They rested on a massive, perfectly sanded white oak bench that Silas had built entirely by hand. They were surrounded by a meticulously engineered circle of heavy river stones. "It is incredibly beautiful," Martha whispered softly, resting her head against his heavy canvas shoulder. "It is finally home," Silas replied deeply, his severely scarred hand covering hers. Deep beneath the rich, freezing soil resting at their heavy leather boots, thousands of tiny, ancient objects were sleeping in the dark. They were wild daisy seeds that Martha had carefully saved from their very first garden in the spring of 1975. They had been preserved in a small glass jar for exactly 51 years, waiting in the absolute darkness for the perfect, uncontaminated earth to finally hold them. They were waiting for the gentle spring thaw. There are some seeds that must wait quietly in the dark for more than half a century before they are finally allowed to bloom. A silent, irrefutable proof of a profound, universal truth. Never rush to discard the old, broken things of this world, or the aging, forgotten people who seem entirely consumed by their inevitable ruin. The true, staggering value of a human soul does not lie in its superficial, fleeting shine. It lies in the fierce, patient hands of those who are willing to reach deep into the heavy ashes and relentlessly polish the buried diamond back to magnificent life.